Shocking discovery on the Hudson River. On a breezy summer afternoon in 1995, the shimmering waters of the Hudson River reflected the golden light of the setting sun. The scene was serene, a postcard-perfect moment typical of New York summers. A group of friends, all teenagers from a local high school, had taken a small rowboat for a leisurely paddle downstream. They laughed, teased each other, and occasionally splashed water as they enjoyed their brief escape from the hustle and bustle of life in the city. About a mile from the closest dock, their carefree adventure took an eerie turn. Floating gently on the calm waters, just ahead of their boat, was a dark plastic bag. Encased in what seemed like layers of old duct tape, it bobbed up and down lazily with the gentle waves. At first, it didn't seem like much to worry about. New Yorkers were used to seeing all sorts of odd things discarded in unexpected places. But as the boat drew closer, an undeniably pungent and sour odor wafted through the air. Jake, the self-proclaimed leader of the group, wrinkled his nose and waved a hand in front of his face. "What is that stink?" he asked, half laughing yet clearly unsettled. One of his friends, Tracy, leaned over the edge of the boat, clutching her camera tightly. "It's probably a dead fish, or worse, rotting trash. God, the Hudson sure is filthy," she quipped, snapping pictures like she always did for the school newspaper. Yet, curiosity got the better of them. Jake, emboldened by his own bravado, reached for the bag using the boat's small oar. Its weight surprised him as he lifted it partially out of the water. "Geez, this thing's heavy," he muttered, and the others gasped as water sloshed out from under the boat. Carefully, he maneuvered the bag into the boat. The friends exchanged nervous looks. It was Tracy who took the step no one else wanted. She grabbed a pocket knife from her bag and began slicing through the wet layers of duct tape. "If this is loaded with gold bars or cash, I'm keeping half," she joked, trying in vain to hide her trembling hands. The plastic parted, and Tracy froze. Horrified gasps filled the air. Inside the bag wasn't money or treasure but something far more sinister: the dismembered remains of a human torso. The exposed flesh was pale, waterlogged, and unmistakably human. A single hand, severed at the wrist, was twisted at an unnatural angle as though trying to escape its grim fate. Chaos erupted. Tracy screamed and stumbled back, almost tipping the boat as she shielded her face. "Oh my God!" she cried. Jake dropped the oar and swore under his breath. "This can't be real! This isn't happening!" Their shouts carried across the water and attracted the attention of a jogger running along the shore. "What's going on out there?" the man yelled, cupping his hands around his mouth. Jake, panic-stricken and realizing they needed help, yelled back, "Call the police! There's a body in the water!" Soon, sirens echoed in the distance. New York Police Department officers and an emergency response team arrived on the scene. The teens were quickly ushered to dry land where they sat on a patch of grass, shivering despite the warmth of the evening. Officers began the grim task of fishing the bag out of the water and sealing it as evidence. Detective Alan Cooper, one of NYPD's most experienced investigators, was immediately called to the scene. Stepping out of his unmarked car, he surveyed the teens, his stern eyes filled with a mixture of concern and frustration. "Kids," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head as he lit a cigarette. Looking over at the medical examiner as they documented the crime scene, he sighed deeply. "So, what are we dealing with here?" "It's still early," the examiner replied, pulling off their gloves. "But based on the decomposition, it looks like this body's been in the water for about 2 or 3 days. Whoever did this didn't bother to conceal it well. They thought dumping it in the river would be enough." Cooper stared at the swirling waters of the Hudson. It wasn't the first time the river had spit back something gruesome, but somehow this felt personal. A message. The body parts. Gut-wrenching clues. Just days after the grotesque discovery on the Hudson River, the mystery deepened and grew darker. Across different corners of New York City, from the leafy edges of Central Park to the dimly lit tunnels of the subway, and even a garbage dump at the edge of the suburbs, more body parts began to surface. Each finding sent waves of shock and distress rippling through the city. The first report came not long after the initial torso discovery. A morning jogger in Central Park was drawn to a curious pile tucked beneath a cluster of bushes. She initially assumed it was just a bag of trash, maybe tossed aside by careless picnickers, but when her dog began barking uncontrollably and tearing at the bag, she got closer. The unmistakable smell of rotting flesh hit her before she even saw the contents. What she found would haunt her forever: a decomposing leg, jagged at the thigh, with skin partially bleached from water damage. She stumbled backward, dropping her phone, and screamed for help. As NYPD descended on the scene, news of another grim find hit their radios. This time, in a seldom-visited section of the city's sprawling subway system, a young worker doing routine maintenance behind a station raised the alarm after spotting something shoved between tracks. At first he thought it was some type of bloody animal carcass, but the jagged human forearm proved otherwise. His voice cracked over the phone as he called 911, describing the twisted, gory scene. "I don't know how it got there," he stammered to the operator. It's so messed up. You need to send someone now." Within hours, a sanitation worker at a suburban landfill added another horrifying piece to the puzzle. While operating a compactor, the worker noticed a splash of dried blood on a large trash bag that had torn open. Against his better judgment, he glanced inside the bag before it could be crushed. His scream echoed across the desolate landfill, and he could hardly stand on his shaking legs as he stumbled toward his supervisor. Another call was made to the police. The pattern was as disturbing as it was deliberate. Body parts scattered intentionally across widely different areas. Each new discovery stretched the investigation wider while deepening the grisly mystery of what had happened to the victim. People became frightened as rumors swirled through neighborhoods and diners. "What kind of monster does this?" an older man muttered to his friend at a corner cafe. "Some psycho's out there treating the city like his personal dumping ground." As forensic teams swept and cataloged each location, Detective Alan Cooper became increasingly grim. The work was methodical, clinical, each part meticulously photographed, bagged, and sent to the medical examiner's office. But Cooper couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just dealing with evidence, they were dealing with someone's life, brutally ripped apart. "This is no simple case," he muttered to his partner Maria Lopez as they exited the crime scene near the subway. "This guy's not just a killer, he's making a statement." At the medical examiner's facility, the urgency was palpable. Each body part that was located and delivered for analysis was added to the growing macabre puzzle. The torso pulled from the Hudson provided a centerpiece, but gaps remained. Literal gaps in identifying the victim. Matching identifiers like skin tone, scars, or tattoos across the various parts became the team's single-minded focus. DNA analysis began as soon as tissue samples were extracted, while fingerprint experts meticulously cleaned and examined fragments of the hands. "It's a young woman," their lead pathologist, Dr. Emery Stanton, said after hours of work that left his gloved hands trembling. "No more than 25 years old, based on decomposition and bruising. She suffered a great deal before she was killed." His voice grew softer as he looked at Detective Cooper. "Whoever did this wanted to erase her, but we won't let that happen. We'll bring her back, at least enough to find out who she was." Over the next few days, leads began to trickle in as the victim's profile was partially reconstructed. A distinctive pattern emerged as more body parts were logged. The killer hadn't simply dumped the remains haphazardly. The locations seemed strategic, almost symbolic, public, yet deliberately difficult to connect back to one another. Cooper spent late nights poring over maps of the city, tracing the bizarre geography of the killer's actions. "What's the message here?" he asked aloud, alone in his small, cluttered office. Piles of crime scene photos were stretched across his desk. "I feel like we're being taunted." The city began to buzz with fear, demand answers, and pressure law enforcement for swift action. The media dubbed the case the Hudson Horror. News anchors with grim expressions relayed each gruesome development as new body parts were uncovered. Citizens, especially women, grew wary of walking alone after dark. Community advisory notices were plastered to lampposts and subway walls, warning New Yorkers to stay vigilant. As the leads continued to tumble in, Detective Lopez pointed out something Cooper had missed during her preliminary sweep of the landfill crime scene. "Look at this, Alan," she said, sliding a photo across his desk. It showed a scrap of torn floral fabric from the dump, stained red but still distinct. "Could be from her clothing," she offered. "We trace this, maybe we get closer to her identity." Cooper picked up the photo, staring at it with furrowed brows. The pattern was vaguely familiar, sparking something in the back of his mind, like a half-remembered dream. "I think," he began before trailing off, reaching for his mug of stale coffee. At that moment, another call buzzed through their precinct's line. A fisherman in Staten Island claimed to have dragged up what might be a piece of someone's face with his net, and they were already dispatching officers to confirm. Detective Cooper stared at the phone receiver in his hand. The gruesome discoveries weren't over, not by a long shot. Identifying the unfortunate woman. The grim task of identifying the young woman whose body had been scattered across New York City began in earnest at the city's Forensic Pathology Center. Detective Alan Cooper had seen his fair share of gruesome cases over the years, but this one gnawed at his very core. A name, an identity, a piece of her stolen humanity needed to be restored. It wasn't just about solving the case, it was about justice for whoever she was. The breakthrough came thanks to the medical examiner's team led by Dr. Emery Stanton. After meticulously piecing together the body parts, having them checked for DNA remnants, and combining their findings with missing persons reports, some vital details started to emerge. "We've got a bit of a profile now," Dr. Stanton said, addressing Cooper and Detective Maria Lopez in a sterile, quiet conference room. Yellowed light illuminated the faces of everyone gathered there, adding a somber tone to the forensic photos spread across the table. "She's young, between 20 and 25 years old, Caucasian, 5 feet 6 inches tall, give or take, based on bone measurements. Definitely athletic. The muscle tone suggests she worked out frequently. And here's an interesting detail," Stanton said, leaning in and pointing to an image. "These scars, a couple small ones on her knee, and what looks like an older surgery scar along her right ankle, could be from a sports injury." "That's something," Cooper muttered. His mind raced through possibilities. A former athlete, college student on a scholarship. "What do you make of the bruising?" Dr. Stanton sighed, fiddling nervously with his latex gloves. "That's where things get more unsettling," he replied. "There are contusions, particularly along her wrists and forearms, suggesting she was restrained, likely with significant force. Defensive wounds on the hands. She fought back." He paused before continuing. "And the blow to the head. Blunt force trauma right to the occipital bone, possibly leading to her death. Whoever did this wanted to make sure she couldn't fight." Lopez crossed her arms and leaned against the wall as Stanton went into further detail. "One of the things that struck us initially was that her dental work was immaculate, not just ordinary braces or fillings either. These are high-end veneers, custom crowns probably done by a very skilled, likely expensive dentist. It suggests she came from money or had access to resources." Detective Lopez looked intrigued. "So we're possibly looking at someone from a wealthier background?" "Possibly," Stanton nodded. "Of course it's just an assumption for now, but expensive dentistry generally narrows things down." Cooper frowned, leaning back in his chair. "She's athletic and well off. You'd think someone like that doesn't just slip through the cracks. Someone's gotta be missing her, raising hell trying to find her. What about tattoos? Identifying marks?" Dr. Stanton handed Cooper another photo. "We did locate a tattoo, small, delicate, a butterfly on her upper shoulder blade. It looked professionally done, subtle, not like something you'd get on a drunken spring break, like she put thought into it." "Search tattoo parlors in the area," Cooper barked at Lopez. "If it's unique, maybe someone remembers giving it to her." He flipped the photo over and stared at it, his expression tightening. "Anything else?" "Actually, yeah," Dr. Stanton added, his voice quieter. "DNA results have already come in." The room fell silent. Cooper and Lopez stared at Stanton, waiting for him to continue. "We ran her DNA against the National CODIS database," Stanton said, carefully choosing his words. "She wasn't in the system. No prior arrests. No history of criminal activity, not even a traffic violation. But," he paused for effect, knowing the weight of what he was about to say, "her results pinged against another DNA profile. It's a familial match." Cooper straightened in his seat. "You're telling me we know who her family is?" "We think so," Stanton confirmed. "Her DNA matches a man named Joseph Collins. He reported his daughter Jennifer Collins missing about 3 weeks ago. She's 27 years old and worked as a jewelry designer based out of Manhattan." Lopez's brow shot up. 3 weeks ago? That timeline could check out. Do we have a photo of her?" Stanton held up a file and handed it over to Cooper. In the top right corner of the paper was a glossy photo of a smiling young woman with chestnut hair and bright eyes. She looked vibrant, full of life, a far cry from what had been discovered in scattered pieces across New York. Cooper studied the photo, his jaw tightening. "She doesn't look like someone who'd disappear without a fight," he muttered. "You said her dad reported her missing. What did they have on file?" "We pulled her missing persons report," Stanton said, flipping through his own documents. "Went out for dinner with friends, left the restaurant early, told them she'd catch an Uber home. The driver says she never got in the car. Last known location was a block away from the restaurant in Midtown." Lopez tilted her head, thinking aloud. "So, whoever did this might have followed her from the restaurant. Midtown isn't exactly deserted at night though. There are cameras everywhere. We checked the footage?" "Already working on it," Stanton assured her. "But with the sheer volume of surveillance in Midtown, it's going to take some time." Cooper rubbed his temples. Time's the one thing we don't have. If Jennifer Collins is our victim, we've got to assume whoever did this is sitting back, enjoying the fact that we're chasing shadows. This isn't a spur-of-the-moment crime, this is calculated, and with how scattered her remains are, they wanted to send a message. Send a message to who? Lopez asked, arms still crossed. Cooper glanced at her. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? To us? To her family? To someone else entirely? Lopez frowned. We need to find her dad. Get a clearer picture of who she was, what her circle looked like. Somebody knows more than they're letting on. Cooper nodded in agreement. Let's bring him in. If there's one thing I know about fathers, they'll shake the earth to find the truth about their daughters, and we need all the help we can get. As the room cleared, and the detectives prepared to track down Jennifer Collins's last steps, the photo of her, smiling and full of life, lay on the table, a haunting reminder of what they had to fix. Somewhere in the city, her story had unraveled into horror, and it was up to Cooper and his team to stitch it back together. The mysterious lover, the first suspicion. When Jennifer Collins's identity was confirmed, her familial and personal connections became the NYPD team's priority. Who she was, who she spent time with, and who might have had a reason to harm her became the new avenues of investigation. And at the center of it all was Jennifer's most recent romantic partner, Ryan Carter. Ryan Carter was a 29-year-old graphic designer who lived in a trendy Manhattan apartment not far from Jennifer. He was attractive, clean-cut, and charismatic. Someone you'd expect to see sipping an iced latte at a Brooklyn cafe. But like so many stories that seem picture-perfect on the surface, cracks were quick to show once investigators started digging. The investigation begins. Detectives Alan Cooper and Maria Lopez first learned of Ryan Carter from Jennifer's father, Joseph Collins. During his emotional meeting at the precinct, Joseph had handed over a list of people Jennifer had been close to before her disappearance. Ryan's name was jotted down in Joseph's meticulous handwriting, but the words scribbled next to it made Cooper frown. Controlling, argued a lot. You said they were dating? Cooper prodded as he scanned the notes. Joseph nodded stiffly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. They were together for a little over a year. I didn't like him much, and I told Jennifer that. Why? Lopez asked gently, leaning in as she jotted notes into her leather-bound notebook. He was possessive, jealous of her male friends, even made snide comments about her colleagues at work, Joseph explained. His jaw tightened. The last time I saw her, she mentioned they'd been fighting more. I told her to leave him, but she said she could handle it. Cooper exchanged a glance with Lopez. Do you know if she'd broken up with him recently? Yes, about a month before she disappeared, Joseph replied. She told me she needed space. That Ryan didn't take it well. I always feared he'd snap. I should have done more. His voice cracked, and the room went silent except for the faint hum of an air conditioning vent overhead, tracking down Ryan Carter. The detectives wasted no time in finding Ryan. It wasn't hard. His social media accounts were still peppered with photos of him and Jennifer, despite her absence. Many posts were sentimental, missing you every day. Others were eerie. If I can't have her, no one can. That's a red flag if I've ever seen one, Lopez muttered, scrolling through the posts from Cooper's desk. Is this guy broadcasting his guilt or what? Could be guilt. Could be attention-seeking, Cooper replied. Either way, we need to talk to him. The next afternoon, Cooper and Lopez arrived at Ryan's apartment. The building was sleek, modern, and reeked of a minimalist chic that screamed money. Ryan opened the door in sweatpants and a hoodie, his hair disheveled and dark circles nesting under his eyes. You're with the police? He asked, slouching against the doorframe. His voice was shaky but cooperative. Detective Cooper, this is Detective Lopez, Cooper said, flashing his badge. Can we come in? Ryan stepped aside, letting them enter. His apartment was spotless, almost too spotless. The white countertops gleamed under the midday sun streaming through expansive windows. What's this about? Ryan asked once they sat down. He picked nervously at the seam of his hoodie, his knee bouncing. Is this about Jennifer? It is, Lopez confirmed. We're sorry for your loss. We just wanted to ask you a few questions about the time leading up to her disappearance. Ryan nodded, eyes darting between the detectives. Of course, anything that helps. Cooper sat forward, his tone calm but probing. When was the last time you saw Jennifer? 3 weeks ago, Ryan replied instantly, but his voice carried a stammer. Actually 4. Yeah, 4 weeks ago, we had coffee. She stopped by to pick up some things she left here after the breakup. Lopez raised an eyebrow. How'd that go? Fine, Ryan said quickly. It was civil, no drama. Cooper let the pause linger before leaning forward. Ryan, Jennifer's father mentioned that the two of you argued a lot near the end of your relationship, that true? Ryan's face darkened, his jaw clenching. Yeah, we fought sometimes, but what couple doesn't? It wasn't serious. Wasn't serious, Cooper echoed, his voice purposely flat. What do you mean by wasn't serious? Did it ever get physical? No! Ryan nearly shouted, his hands flying up defensively. I'd never lay a hand on her, never. Suspicion builds. For now, the detectives had no evidence to indicate Ryan was lying, but something about his shaky demeanor and overly defensive tone didn't sit right with Cooper. When they left the apartment, Lopez voiced what was on both their minds. He's either involved or he's hiding something, she said as they climbed into their car. The breakup was a month ago, Cooper added, sliding into the driver's seat. But he's still got those weepy, possessive Instagram posts. Something doesn't add up. Let's see if he's got an alibi for the night Jennifer went missing. It didn't take long to gather what they needed. Ryan claimed he had been at a friend's apartment the night Jennifer disappeared, drinking beer and watching the Knicks game. That friend, Todd Myers, corroborated the story. Still, the detectives dug deeper. They combed through Ryan's credit card transactions, searched for surveillance footage that might place him elsewhere, and interviewed neighbors. But Ryan's alibi checked out. Every lead tied him to Todd's apartment that night. No evidence linked him to Jennifer's disappearance, let alone the grisly discoveries along the Hudson. But what about the note? As the investigation dragged on, one odd detail resurfaced, a handwritten note found in Jennifer's jewelry studio. It was stuck to her desk, written on a yellow sticky pad in rushed handwriting and addressed in thinly veiled ambiguity. We need to talk. Call me. Please. Signed just with an R. Lopez circled the note in her case file. You think he wrote this? Could have been Ryan, Cooper said, or another R. Maybe there's someone else we haven't looked into yet. A friend, a new boyfriend. The note was simple yet haunting, a desperate plea that might have been ignored right before Jennifer vanished. But with no fingerprints on the paper and little context, the investigators were once again left staring into the void. Unresolved questions. Although Ryan Carter wasn't eliminated as a suspect, the lack of hard evidence meant he was left alone for now. Cooper and Lopez agreed that someone still had answers they were slowly uncovering, one step at a time. But as they drove out of Manhattan that evening, the thought lingered in Cooper's mind. Was Ryan really who he pretends to be, or were we just looking in the wrong place? Lopez, resting her head against the window, murmured, If he didn't do it, someone sure as hell wants us to think he did. Traces that couldn't be erased. The beginning of the real breakthrough in the Jennifer Collins case wasn't in the grand leads or loud revelations, but in the subtle, grimy traces left behind. Tiny footprints of someone desperate to cover their tracks. And no matter how meticulous a killer thinks they are, they always miss something. The crime scene revisited Jennifer's apartment wasn't the scene of a violent struggle. On the surface it was clean, even unnervingly so. But seasoned detectives like Alan Cooper and Maria Lopez knew better. They knew how to look beyond the polished countertops and the sprayed-off sinks. They called it their sixth sense for crime scenes, a sense that kicked in the moment they stepped into her place with a team of forensic specialists. A standard luminol sweep, a chemical spray used to detect blood that isn't visible to the naked eye, was conducted on Jennifer's bright hardwood floors. Initially, everything appeared untouched. Shit! I thought for sure this killer left a mark, Lopez muttered under her breath as she adjusted her gloves, looking over at her partner. But as the team began moving deeper into the space, a faint blue glow started emerging under the ultraviolet light. It wasn't dramatic, but it was there, faint streaks of blood pooling near the base of the kitchen counter and trailing toward the adjacent living room. Cooper crouched down to examine the stains. This wasn't a normal injury, this is spatter, it's directional, he observed, nodding toward the forensic chemist. Someone was dragging her body through here. Lopez, standing over him with her hands on her hips, frowned. Whatever happened, it wasn't in a frenzy. Look, that blood trail isn't chaotic, it's deliberate, calm, almost planned. She didn't die here, Cooper replied firmly, but she bled here. Let's keep going. The evidence builds. The floor wasn't the only thing that betrayed the killer. Near the kitchen sink, tucked behind bottles of cleaning products that had been neatly arranged, forensic investigators uncovered a surprise, a strip of gray duct tape, its edges jagged from being cut hastily. Lopez stared at it. Would you look at that? Matches the material used on the body bags we found in the river. Cooper carefully examined the way a strand of hair stuck to the adhesive. It was chestnut brown, the same shade as Jennifer's. "Bingo," he muttered, his voice grave. "Our killer used duct tape to bind her, probably before they disposed of her remains." The tape, while damning, was just a piece of the puzzle. The forensics chimed in again as they opened Jennifer's kitchen trash can, which had been emptied recently, save for a single item, a blood-smeared kitchen knife. The killer, it seemed, hadn't thought through how closely each detail would be scrutinized. Lopez picked up the evidence bag containing the knife, her expression dark. "This looks like standard kitchen cutlery. Simple, unobtrusive, not the kind of thing someone plans a killing with." Cooper nodded. "Fits the profile. This wasn't an opportunistic street mugging gone wrong. This was personal. The killer brought her here, used what was available, and cleaned up after themselves as best they could, but you can never erase everything." Blood in the gaps. What really confounded the detectives was the trace evidence embedded where the mop and bleach couldn't reach. In the crevices between floorboards, small flecks of blood had seeped in, unnoticed at first glance. DNA testing already confirmed that it matched Jennifer. "It's like this person wanted to erase her from existence," Cooper murmured as he peered at the forensic photos. "But they had to make mistakes. Nobody's capable of scrubbing out human nature from a scene completely." It wasn't just the blood. Forensic specialists found faint shoe prints on the floor, partial but enough to raise eyebrows. Judging by the tread, the shoes appeared to be large work boots, definitely not Jennifer's. "Couldn't be the boyfriend's either," Lopez said, flipping through her notes. "Ryan Carter's a sneaker kind of guy, lives in flashy Nikes, at least from the photos we saw in his apartment. Then we're looking at someone else, someone who wanted to play janitor quickly but didn't think small enough to wipe their footprints out properly. Incriminating subtleties. Another hint of foul play came from an inconspicuous stain on the walls, not blood this time but bleach residue found near the light switches. UV testing showed streaks where someone had obsessively scrubbed with a chemical cleaner. If anything, the cleaning effort itself became evidence of a guilty conscience. "Why just this area?" Lopez asked, noting how spotless the walls leading to the doorframe appeared under UV light. "The killer wasn't trying to clean the whole apartment, just specific places." "Which means there could have been important prints right there before they wiped it down," Cooper noted. He bent closer to examine the subtle swipe pattern, the kind made by textured rubber gloves. They were careful, but not careful enough. The killer's oversight. Among the more bizarre pieces discovered in Jennifer's apartment was a drained bottle of chloroform, hidden beneath the bathroom sink. The detectives had it tested and cross-checked with the killer's possible timeline. "This is intentional," Cooper said grimly, handing the analysis to Lopez. "The kind of thing you buy off sketchy websites and use when you're planning something like this. It wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment crime of passion, but they hadn't expected the biggest clue to come from the tiniest detail, a strand of synthetic fibers from what appeared to be a glove. It was snagged on the edge of Jennifer's kitchen table, almost invisible to the naked eye. When forensics peeled it off and examined it under magnification, it was identified as part of industrial work gloves, the type used by blue-collar laborers handling machinery or harsh chemicals. Lopez's eyes lit up. "Blue-collar, worn boots. This isn't Ryan. This is someone completely different. But someone who had access to her place," Cooper reminded her solemnly. "Someone she trusted enough to let in. Or someone with a key." It was a jarring development. The focus began shifting away from Jennifer's boyfriend, Ryan Carter, and toward an entirely new angle. The killer was organized, methodical, yet sloppy in their own arrogance, leaving faint traces behind like breadcrumbs. "This wasn't random," Lopez whispered to herself as they packed up their findings and prepared to visit Jennifer's landlord for a list of duplicate keys. "This was personal, and whoever did this thought they'd covered it up. They thought wrong." Closing in. As Cooper and Lopez left the now haunting scene of Jennifer's apartment, the evidence they collected spoke louder than any witness. The traces of blood, the duct tape, the knife, and the fibers, all pointed toward someone who wanted Jennifer gone but never expected they'd need to defend their actions against the persistence of trained eyes. "Every mistake they made here is one step closer to us finding them," Cooper said as he lit a cigarette outside the building. His face was stoic, determined. "Nobody gets away with making this big of a mess." "And if they do," Lopez added, her hands tightening into fists, "we're going to gut their sense of security piece by piece." The universe, she thought, had a way of punishing killers who underestimated the weight of their imperfections. The quiet but suspicious neighbor. Joe Matthews was the kind of man who blended into the background of any neighborhood. In his mid-50s, with thinning hair and an unremarkable build, he never stood out much, just another New Yorker in a sea of faces. His neighbors described him as quiet, polite, but also a little odd. He was the guy who always seemed to be around but never caused any trouble, which made his name showing up in the Jennifer Collins case all the more surprising. The detective's attention fell on Joe after a routine check of the building's security footage. One grainy clip showed him lingering near Jennifer's apartment door late on the very night she disappeared. He wasn't doing anything overtly suspicious, just pacing back and forth in that poorly lit hallway, occasionally glancing toward her door. But timing was everything in cases like these, and to Detectives Alan Cooper and Maria Lopez, Joe's late-night hallway stroll immediately raised questions. A knock at the door. The detectives decided to drop by his apartment unannounced. Cooper rapped on the door of Unit 4D sharply, the sound echoing through the quiet hallway. It took almost a full minute before Joe opened the door, peeking out cautiously like a man who wasn't expecting guests, or didn't want them. "Yes?" he asked, his voice hesitant, barely above a whisper. "Mr. Matthews, we're Detectives Cooper and Lopez with the NYPD, Cooper said, flashing his badge. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about your neighbor, Jennifer Collins." The mention of Jennifer's name seemed to drain the blood from Joe's face. His fingers tightened on the edge of the door. I heard about what happened," he stammered, glancing nervously at the detectives. "Terrible, just terrible." "May we come in?" Lopez asked, her tone firm but not unkind. Joe hesitated before finally stepping aside. His apartment was organized to the point of discomfort, every surface clean, every object in its proper place like it hadn't been touched in weeks. It smelled faintly of pine sol, so strong it almost made Lopez's eyes water. "Forgive the intrusion," Cooper began as they stepped inside. "We're speaking with neighbors to see if anyone noticed anything unusual the night Jennifer disappeared." "You live just down the hall from her, correct?" Joe nodded quickly. Yes, just a few doors down." "Did you know her well?" Lopez pressed, watching him closely as she scribbled notes into her pad. She was nice," he muttered, avoiding their eyes. "Quiet mostly, always said hello." He paused as if debating how much to share. "She made jewelry, right? I think she mentioned it once. She gave me a business card months ago. I think I still have it somewhere." Lopez smiled faintly. "That's right. She was a jewelry designer. You must have talked to her more than once to know that." Joe fidgeted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the apartment like he was searching for a distraction. "I mean, not much. Just in passing." The suspicious hallway footage. Cooper leaned forward slightly, bringing the conversation back to the footage. "Mr. Matthews, our building security footage shows you walking near Jennifer's door late the night she disappeared. You seemed to linger there for quite some time. Can you explain why?" Joe's reaction was immediate and visceral. His eyes widened, his face flushed a deep shade of red, and his voice rose in pitch. "Oh, no, that's a mistake. I wasn't lingering. Sometimes I walk at night, for exercise." Lopez raised an eyebrow, locking eyes with Cooper before responding. "You walk in the hallway, past the same door over and over?" Joe hesitated, swallowing hard. He was visibly sweating now. "Look, I couldn't sleep, okay? I wasn't doing anything wrong." "Did you see Jennifer that night?" Cooper asked pointedly. "No!" Joe almost shouted, then caught himself and lowered his tone. "No, I didn't see her. I didn't hear anything either," he added quickly. "I swear." A man with secrets. Joe's defensiveness only made him more suspicious to the detectives. Cooper's gut told him the man was hiding something. He just couldn't decide if it was directly linked to Jennifer's murder or simply a lifetime of mistrust and paranoia. Either way, they pressed on. "So, just to be clear, you didn't see or hear anything unusual that night?" Cooper repeated, watching Joe closely. "No," Joe said again, shaking his head. "Nothing. Look, I didn't even know anything happened until the cops showed up the next day. I barely leave my apartment. I keep to myself." Lopez's voice softened, though her words were carefully chosen. "Mr. Matthews, you can understand how your behavior caught our attention. You were in a location and at a time that's now crucial to this investigation. If there's anything you're not telling us, this is your chance to come clean." Joe's lips twitched as if he wanted to say more but couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he shook his head. "I've told you everything I know." Unanswered questions. After leaving the apartment, Lopez exhaled sharply, turning to Cooper. "What do you think? He's twitchy as hell. If he's not guilty, he's definitely hiding something." "He's hiding something," Cooper agreed, glancing back at the door as they walked back down the hallway. "But the question is, what? He's odd, sure, but odd doesn't always mean guilty. Maybe he saw something that night but doesn't want to get involved." "Or maybe he's our guy," Lopez countered grimly. A new clue. Later that evening, the detectives reviewed the hallway footage again in the precinct. Lopez froze the video on a single frame, pointing at Joe's figure. "Look here. He's not just pacing, Alan. There. He stops at her door. You see that? His hand's at the handle. What the hell was he doing? Trying to get in?" Cooper squinted, leaning closer to the screen. "It's not enough to say he's guilty of anything, though. He'll just claim he knocked to say hello and didn't stay long." Lopez frowned, leaning back in her chair. "We need more. Something concrete. Maybe the tech team can enhance this footage, see if he's carrying anything when he leaves the frame." As they dug deeper, a call came in from the forensic team still working Jennifer's apartment. "Detective Lopez," the voice on the line began, "you're going to want to know this. We found partial prints on Jennifer's door handle. Not hers. And not her boyfriend's." Lopez's brows shot up. "Anybody we can match it to?" "We're running it now." Cooper leaned forward. "I'll bet you a beer Joe Matthews' prints are on that door." A long night ahead. With this new lead, the detectives redoubled their focus on the quiet neighbor. Whether Joe Matthews was simply a lonely man haunted by bad timing or something far more sinister, Cooper and Lopez weren't about to let his story end without answers. Somewhere within his nervous eyes and trembling hands lay the truth. They just had to dig deep enough to uncover it. The turning point in the investigation came when an anonymous tip led the NYPD to a desolate industrial yard on the outskirts of Queens. The yard was full of rusting machinery, piles of scrap metal and abandoned vehicles, a graveyard for things long forgotten by the city. Among the debris sat a battered white box truck, its paint chipped and faded, with crudely spray-painted letters indicating it belonged to a defunct moving company. At first glance it looked no different from the dozens of other rusting relics scattered across the yard, but to Detective Alan Cooper, something about the truck screamed out for attention. The call reporting its location had been vague. "There's a truck near Hazel Scrapyard. I think it's connected to that missing woman you're looking for." No name, no callback number. "Anonymous tips that pan out," Lopez muttered as they pulled into the yard. "Yeah, that's every rookie detective's dream. Let's hope this one doesn't waste our time." Cooper killed the engine and stepped out of the unmarked sedan. The air was thick with the metallic tang of rust and the faint stench of oil. "Doesn't feel like much of a dream," he replied, squinting at the mid-afternoon sun glaring down on them. "It's too damn quiet around here." The scene of interest. As they approached the truck, its dented rear doors caught their attention. One door hung slightly ajar, revealing a pitch-black interior. Cooper drew his flashlight, shining it inside as Lopez gloved up and began working the latch to open the truck fully. A stale, sour odor wafted out immediately. Faint at first, but unmistakably familiar to both detectives. The kind of smell that spoke of decay. "Jesus," Lopez muttered, taking an instinctive step back as she covered her nose with her sleeve. "That smell. Alan, that's not just old garbage." "Doesn't have to be a body to smell like that," Cooper said grimly, though his expression betrayed his own unease. His flashlight beam swept over the interior, revealing a chaotic mess of discarded items. Black garbage bags sloppily piled in one corner, smears of dark stains on the scratched metal floor, and something chillingly out of place, a blood-stained tarp folded neatly in the middle of the space. "Gloves are on," Lopez said, her voice steady but tinged with an edge of tension. She climbed into the truck and carefully tugged at the garbage bags one by one. They were heavy, tied tightly, and layered with duct tape. "You want the honors, or should I get the forensics boys to have their fun?" "No time for jokes," Cooper replied, handing her his folding knife. He stood at the ready, one hand on his phone, prepared to call the crime scene unit if needed. Lopez sliced through the layers of tape on the first bag and carefully peeled it open. What spilled out wasn't immediately alarming. Pieces of clothing, including a floral blouse crumpled and soaked with dried blood. The next layer, however, was more damning. A pair of pale blue sneakers, one of them missing its shoelaces but visibly stained with dark blotches. "Alan!" Lopez trailed off, holding out the blouse under the thin beam of his flashlight. The fabric showcased a distinct floral pattern, not unlike the scrap they'd found at the landfill site weeks ago, stained red, but still recognizable. "Matches the victim's," Cooper said, his voice low. "Get everything bagged. This is Jennifer's." The notebook of secrets. The bigger surprise came from a second bag. Inside they found a tear-stained paperback notebook, its brittle pages covered in hurried, messy handwriting. The contents sent shivers running up their spines. Disjointed phrases like guilt, jealousy is a sickness, and the word punishment scrawled multiple times across different pages. Some entries appeared to be incoherent ramblings. She laughed, but it wasn't like before, and love drives the weak into madness stood alongside crude drawings, sketches of what looked like women's faces with their eyes scratched out. It's insane rambling, Lopez muttered, trying to steady her hands as she flipped through the pages. No, Lopez, it's premeditated, Cooper replied. This isn't rage losing control. This is someone obsessed, spiraling into planning. The very last page of the notebook contained something more chilling, a list of items: tape, tarp, gloves, bleach, a checklist for cleaning up a crime scene, and next to tape was something more specific. Truck. This wasn't a dump site, Lopez said, closing the notebook softly. This is where they organized everything, packaged the evidence. They probably tied up Jennifer in here before. She let her words drop, unwilling to finish the thought. The past owner of the truck. Back at the precinct, detectives wasted no time tracing the vehicle's registration records. The truck, once used by a defunct Brooklyn-based moving company, had inexplicably changed hands several times in the last 5 years. The current registration identified a name already familiar to investigators: Mark Thompson, a former co-worker of Jennifer's at the jewelry studio where she worked. We already questioned him, Lopez said sharply. She rapped her knuckles against Cooper's desk as he stared at Mark's file. And he didn't give a shit, Cooper replied, flipping through pages of notes from their earlier interview. Thompson had played it cool when questioned the first time, acting shocked by Jennifer's disappearance but offering little more than vague pleasantries about their work relationship. Nothing Cooper could use to press him further. But why the hell does he have this truck? Lopez asked, pacing near the whiteboard covered in crime scene photos and evidence links. Mark's slipping now. He shouldn't have left this behind. It connects him. Exactly. It's stupidity born of arrogance, Cooper said, his tone resolute. He thinks he can outsmart us, but he just left breadcrumbs leading right back to him. Closing in on Mark Thompson, the notebook, the bloody clothing, and the truck were enough to secure a search warrant for Mark Thompson's home. Cooper stood behind the task force team as they combed through his property on a rainy morning, mud sticking to their boots as they unearthed more damning evidence. Boxes of duct tape matching the brand from the garbage bags, work gloves with traces of Jennifer's DNA, and Jennifer's phone, buried at the bottom of a drawer inside his garage. Lopez clenched her jaw as they logged each piece of evidence. Truck, gloves, bleach. The psychopath had a plan, but plans fall apart when you get sloppy. Cooper pulled her aside, his eyes grim. This is the nail in the coffin. The forensic team's going to match every thread back to Jennifer. We've got him. You know what bothers me the most? Lopez asked, exhaling sharply. He probably thought he could keep going, that she wasn't going to be his last victim. Then it's a good thing we're going to shut him down, Cooper replied. He glanced toward the darkened garage where technicians were still sifting through Mark's belongings. He can keep his goddamn secrets locked in his own head now. The evidence speaks for itself. The unlikely killer. It wasn't who they expected. From the start of the investigation, detectives Alan Cooper and Maria Lopez had followed the most obvious threads: the controlling ex-boyfriend, the quiet and twitchy neighbor, even the mysterious movements around the abandoned box truck. All signs pointed toward people who either had a known connection to Jennifer Collins or seemed to fall into suspicious patterns that screamed for further investigation. But Mark Thompson? He was never meant to be a suspect. A former co-worker at the jewelry studio where Jennifer worked, Mark was a man who barely showed up on their radar in the early stages of the case. He was distant, mild-mannered, and most importantly, cooperative when questioned initially. He offered condolences, talked about Jennifer's bright talent and her eye for detail, and brushed off further probing with sharp but polite responses. He didn't set off any alarms, at least not at first, so when the bloody truck was traced back to him, it almost didn't compute. How could this soft-spoken man, who co-workers described as helpful but awkward, turn out to be capable of such brutality? The mask starts to slip. Mark Thompson's arrest came quietly in the middle of the night. With the evidence stacked against him, Jennifer's clothing, the bloodied tarp, and the damning notebook discovered in the abandoned truck, Detective Cooper and a team of officers arrived at Mark's 2-story townhouse in Staten Island. The house was dimly lit, its lawn unkempt with a faint shadow showing movement behind the blinds. He's home, Cooper said tersely, signaling to the officers to surround the property. Let's keep this clean. Mark answered the door after only a few knocks, his face pale but composed. Detective Cooper, he greeted hoarsely, blinking as though unsure if he were dreaming. "It's late. What's this about?" "We've got a warrant, Mark," Cooper said, his tone steady, a subtle edge of authority creeping into his voice. "Step aside." Lopez watched as Mark's face shifted, not outright panic but a flicker of something, and then, just as quickly, it was gone. "You're making a mistake," he mumbled as officers guided him toward the couch and handed him the warrant. "I haven't done anything wrong." "You want to save that statement for your lawyer?" Lopez quipped, crossing her arms. Mark's eyes darted toward her, then away. This is ridiculous." As officers began combing through the house, boxes were opened, drawers were emptied, and every corner of Mark's eerily tidy home was examined. In the garage, they found duct tape matching the type from the truck and Jennifer's apartment. Upstairs, they seized Jennifer's missing phone from a nightstand drawer, alongside strands of hair that forensic evidence would later confirm as hers. "What's all this, Mark?" Cooper asked, holding up the phone in an evidence bag. He was leaning back against the living room wall, arms crossed, his tone almost casual. "How'd this end up in your house if you didn't do anything wrong?" Mark stared at it, his lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't know," he said weakly. His hands clenched into fists as he avoided eye contact. Lopez leaned forward from her chair across the room, her voice sharp and deliberate. "Mark, we found Jennifer's blood in that truck. We found the notebook. We found the clothes. You know what's next, right?" Mark froze. For a moment it was as though everything around him disappeared. The room, the officers, even the detectives. He blinked slowly, and then his lips parted. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he whispered, the words almost inaudible. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that." The confession. The moment the words left his mouth, the tension in the room thickened. Cooper straightened, exchanging a glance with Lopez, who nodded silently. They had him. "Why don't you tell us what did happen?" Cooper asked, his voice calm, measured. He gestured for the junior officers to give them space. "Jennifer deserves the truth, Mark. Her family deserves the truth." Mark's hands trembled as he wrung them together. His face, ghostly pale under the living room lamp, looked as though it could collapse under the weight of what he was about to say. "I loved her," he choked out, his eyes welling with tears. "She didn't see it, she couldn't see it." Lopez's jaw tightened, but she remained silent, letting him continue. She always treated me like a co-worker, like nothing more. I complimented her work, helped her finish projects, even stayed late just to make sure she noticed, but she didn't care. She just laughed, kept throwing me these pity smiles. "So you followed her," Cooper stated, his voice unwavering. "I didn't follow her," Mark snapped, his tone suddenly defensive before softening again. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. I just wanted to talk to her. That night I followed her from the restaurant after her friends left. She always walked so fast, like she didn't even want to stop and acknowledge people. I called out to her. She ignored me." "What happened after that?" Lopez pressed, her tone losing patience. Mark's breath hitched as the tears spilled over. "She told me to leave her alone. She looked scared of me like I was some freak, and I grabbed her arm. I wanted to explain, to tell her that everything I've done, it's been for her." "And you took her back to the apartment?" Cooper asked. Mark nodded slowly, his body slumping like a puppet with its strings cut. "She wouldn't stop screaming," he muttered. "I tried to calm her down, but she kept fighting me. I panicked." "What happened next, Mark?" Cooper's tone was firm now, unrelenting. I didn't mean to hurt her," Mark repeated, barely above a whisper. She fell, hit her head. There was blood, so much blood. I thought she was dead, and then she wasn't, and I just..." His voice cracked, and he buried his head in his hands. "I didn't know what to do." Lopez's knuckles whitened as she gripped her notebook tightly. "So you dumped her body? You cut her up? Scattered her around the city like garbage?" Mark sobbed. "I didn't know how else to make it all go away. I didn't want anyone to think I..." He stopped himself, his voice collapsing under the unbearable weight of his crime. "You didn't want anyone to think you're a killer," Cooper finished bitterly, shaking his head. "But here we are." The unraveling Mark's confession was enough to hold him, and over the following week, detectives pieced together the full story. The forensic evidence from Jennifer's apartment and the truck lined up perfectly with his story. The chloroform bottle in her bathroom cabinet? Mark had purchased it online weeks prior, planning to subdue her if she wouldn't listen. The duct tape, the tarp, the bleach, it all painted the picture of premeditation, even if Mark claimed it was an accident. "This wasn't about love," Lopez muttered to Cooper after their final interrogation. "This was control, obsession." And when he couldn't control her, Cooper replied, it turned to violence. Mark Thompson would eventually face trial for first-degree murder, his deceit unmasked and meticulously laid bare by a mountain of evidence. Jennifer Collins's tragic story, though horrifying, served as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked obsession, and the lengths people like Mark would go to when their illusions of control fell apart. As Cooper walked out of the precinct the day of Mark's arraignment, he lit a cigarette and exhaled deeply, staring into the distance. Some people wear their evil on their sleeves, he said softly to Lopez, who stood next to him, arms crossed. But others, they hide it under a smile, under small talk at work, under a name in someone's phone. Lopez glanced at him, her eyes tired but resolute. And you know what they all have in common? She asked. They think they're smarter than the rest of us? Smarter than justice? Cooper nodded, flicking his cigarette into the gutter. But justice always catches up. The psychological twist. Mark's mother steps forward. It was an unexpected knock at the precinct door that morning, the kind of quiet interruption that carried far more weight than anyone realized at first. It wasn't another lead or a piece of forensic evidence, it was a visitor, an older woman with her head held high yet a hesitancy in her step that betrayed her intentions. Detective Maria Lopez was the first to notice her, standing awkwardly near the entrance, clutching a worn leather purse with both hands. Her face was lined with years of worry, her hair a dirty gray pulled back into a neat bun, and her clothes suggested someone who had worked hard her entire life, a navy cardigan and sensible shoes. She looked like she didn't belong in a police precinct, but something about her expression stopped Lopez in her tracks. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Lopez asked, stepping closer, her notebook tucked under one arm. "Yes, The woman's voice was soft, almost lost in the hum of the precinct's chaos. She cleared her throat and tried again. I'm Margaret Thompson, Mark Thompson's mother." Lopez blinked, caught off guard by the name. She glanced over her shoulder toward Cooper, who was leaning against his desk and flipping through Mark's case files. "Alan, you're going to want to come over here." A mother's plea. Margaret was seated in one of the interrogation rooms, her hands nervously fidgeting with the strap of her purse. Cooper and Lopez entered together, both wearing expressions of curiosity mixed with skepticism. She looked up at them, her weathered face quivering with an unspoken urgency. "Mrs. Thompson," Cooper began, sitting across from her, "we weren't expecting to see you here today." "I wasn't sure if I'd come," Margaret admitted, her voice shaking but steady enough to be heard. "But, after everything, I couldn't stay quiet. Mark's my son and I love him, but something's gone wrong. Something's been wrong for a long time." Lopez tilted her head, leaning forward slightly. "What do you mean by wrong, Mrs. Thompson?" Margaret hesitated, her fingers gripping her purse tighter. "Mark was a good boy, always quiet, always polite, but after his father died..." Her voice cracked, and she took a deep breath before continuing. "Something changed in him. He became more withdrawn, more angry, but not the kind of anger you yell about, the kind that sits inside you and festers." "And he took it out on Jennifer?" Cooper asked bluntly, though his tone was measured. Margaret flinched at the question, her hands trembling. "I don't know. I don't want to believe he could do such a thing, but..." She reached into her purse, pulling out a large kitchen knife wrapped in a plastic bag. "I found this hidden in the basement after the police searched our house. I think it's what he used on that poor girl." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking like a stone. Evidence from a mother's conscience. Lopez's eyes widened as she stared at the knife, the blade still darkened by stains that forensic tests would undoubtedly confirm as blood. She immediately reached for the evidence bag on the table and slid it toward Margaret. "You found this after we left?" Lopez asked, her voice calm but sharp with focus. "Why didn't you bring it to us immediately?" "I wrestled with it for days," Margaret admitted, her eyes filling with tears. "He's my son. My only son. I kept telling myself it wasn't true, that he couldn't have done what you're saying he did, but every time I walked past the basement stairs, I kept thinking about Jennifer, about her family. I don't know how they go on not knowing the truth." Cooper exchanged a glance with Lopez, his mouth set in a grim line. "Mrs. Thompson, I know this isn't easy for you, but this knife, it could be the final piece of evidence we need to put Mark away. With what you've told us and what we've already found, this seals the case." Margaret nodded shakily. "I know. A mother's guilt." Lopez leaned forward, her tone softening slightly. "Why do you think he did it, Mrs. Thompson? What could have driven him to this?" Margaret's voice faltered, but she eventually spoke. "Mark, he doesn't know how to deal with rejection. He's always been awkward with people, especially women. I think he thought Jennifer was different. He latched onto her like he never latched onto anyone else, and when she didn't feel the same way, she paused, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of the world rested on them. He got angry, desperate. My son, he doesn't know how to let go. He doesn't just have anger issues, Cooper said bluntly. We're looking at someone who planned this, who tried to cover their tracks, who went to extremes to make sure no one uncovered the truth. This wasn't a crime of passion, Mrs. Thompson. This was calculated. Margaret flinched but nodded. You're right, there were always signs. The way he'd obsess over small things, keep lists, plan every hour of his day. His room is full of notebooks, just like the one you found in the truck. But I didn't want to see it. What kind of mother wants to see that their son... She broke off, covering her face with her hands. The pursuit of justice. Cooper sighed, his voice softening for the first time. No parent wants to believe their child is capable of something like this. But you stepping forward now? This might be the first real justice Jennifer's family gets. Margaret looked up at him, her cheeks wet with tears. She didn't deserve this, I know that. No one deserves what happened to her. I just wish I'd seen it sooner. Maybe I could have helped Mark before it got this far. It's not your fault, Lopez said firmly. What he did, that's on him. Margaret swallowed hard, nodding even as fresh tears escaped. You'll make sure he pays for this? That he can't hurt anyone else? We will, Cooper said. His tone left no room for doubt. Closing the chapter. As Margaret was escorted out of the precinct, Lopez exhaled deeply, leaning back in her chair. She glanced at the evidence bag containing the knife, knowing it would become one of the most crucial pieces of the case. She didn't have to do this, Lopez said, almost to herself. You think Mark would have stayed quiet if his mother hadn't stepped forward? People like Mark don't stay quiet forever, Cooper replied, his voice low. But she saved us months of chasing dead ends, and she saved another family from going through what Jennifer's did. Lopez folded her arms, watching Margaret disappear out the door. A mother breaking her own heart to do the right thing, that's damn rare, Alan. Rare doesn't cover it, Cooper muttered, before pushing himself to his feet. Let's make sure her pain counts for something. We've got work to do. The historic trial and the harsh sentence. The trial of Mark Thompson became an extraordinary moment in New York's legal history. It wasn't just another courtroom proceeding, but a stage upon which the deep consequences of obsession, violence, and justice were laid bare. From the haunting forensic evidence to the powerful testimonies, the trial gripped not just the city, but the entire nation. People tuned in every day, eager to know the fate of the man who had torn apart Jennifer Collins's life and devastated her family. The frenzy of public interest. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed like sharks circling fresh bait. Reporters stood poised with their microphones, live streaming the case updates with somber voices and dramatic headlines. Obsession turned deadly, justice for Jennifer, and the killer next door. He's the face of a monster, one reporter said as their camera panned to an image of Mark, shackled and being escorted into the building. His gaunt face and disheveled demeanor became a symbol of the case, plastered across newspapers and TV screens nationwide. Protesters lined the courthouse steps, holding signs with Jennifer's picture, "Justice for Jennifer," "Stop Violence Against Women," or simply "Monster." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was no less charged. Detectives Alan Cooper and Maria Lopez sat in the gallery, watching their months of hard work and sleepless nights come to fruition. Jennifer's family filled the front row, her mother clutching a framed photo of Jennifer as tears silently streaked her face. Their presence was a constant reminder of why everyone was there. The evidence, a damning puzzle. The prosecution built their case meticulously, presenting every painstakingly assembled piece of evidence like chapters in a tragic story. The bloodied tarp from the abandoned truck, the duct tape with her hair stuck to it recovered from Mark's garage, the floral-patterned blouse, once vibrant and now forever stained with Jennifer's blood. Each sealed plastic bag was carried carefully by a forensic technician to the evidence table. "This was not an accident," the lead prosecutor Diane Mercer said as she paced confidently in front of the jury. Her tone was steady, but her words stung like cold steel. "This was premeditated. This was calculated. Mark Thompson didn't just kill Jennifer Collins, he planned it." She held up the notebook recovered from the truck, its pages filled with Mark's erratic scribbles about jealousy, control, and punishment. "This is not the writing of an innocent man. This is the mind of someone who couldn't handle rejection and decided that if he couldn't have Jennifer, no one could." Screens were set up in the courtroom displaying footage of the hallway camera. The grainy black and white video showed Mark pacing outside Jennifer's apartment on the night she disappeared, pausing with his hand on her door handle. Diane Mercer turned toward the jury, gesturing dramatically toward the screen. "There he is, waiting, calculating, obsessing over his next move. That's the man responsible for what we're here to discuss." The defense, a shallow plea. Mark's defense attorney, Eric Hayes, tried to paint a different story. He argued that Mark was mentally unwell, a troubled man who had been pushed too far by the stress of losing his father and his unrequited love for Jennifer. He described Mark as a man overcome by emotions who made a tragic mistake. "This was not premeditated murder," Hayes insisted. "This was an emotional outburst gone horribly wrong. My client did not wake up that morning intending to kill Jennifer Collins." Mark himself sat silently throughout most of the trial, his head hung low, his expression unreadable. But when he was called to testify, the courtroom held its collective breath. I loved her," Mark muttered, his voice barely audible. The microphone picked up the trembling in his words. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." The prosecutor wasted no time tearing into his statement. "You loved her so much," she mocked, pacing the floor, "that you bought chloroform. You loved her so much that you brought duct tape to her apartment. Is that what love looks like to you, Mr. Thompson?" Mark crumbled under the pressure, stammering incoherent attempts to justify his actions, but his words only deepened the jury's doubt about his innocence. As he spoke, Jennifer's mother turned away, unable to look at the man who had taken her daughter from her. The emotional testimonies. Perhaps the most powerful moment of the trial came when Jennifer's mother, Eleanor Collins, took the stand. Dressed in black, her hands shook as she held a tissue, but her voice was unnervingly steady. "She was the light of my life," Eleanor said, her voice heavy with the kind of pain that could silence an entire room. "Jennifer wasn't just my daughter. She was my best friend. She had dreams. She wanted to design jewelry that would bring happiness to people. And now, because of him, because of one person's obsession, she's gone." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom as Eleanor described the days of waiting, hoping Jennifer might still be found alive, and the devastating moment they learned about the scattered pieces of her body. "I had to bury her in pieces," she said, her voice breaking but her gaze fixed on Mark. "What kind of person does that?" The jury was visibly shaken, some glancing at Mark with thinly veiled disgust. Even those watching in the public gallery struggled to hold back their emotions. The verdict. When the jury returned after deliberating for just 6 hours, the courtroom was completely silent. Mark sat stiffly, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Jennifer's family held on to one another, bracing for the decision. The foreperson stood and announced, "We, the jury, find the defendant Mark Thompson guilty of murder in the first degree." Jennifer's mother let out a sob, clutching her daughter's photograph as tears streamed down her face. Cooper and Lopez exchanged a knowing glance. Justice had been served. The sentence. At the sentencing hearing, the judge didn't hold back. Addressing Mark directly, he spoke with a voice full of authority and condemnation. "Your actions were not only despicable, Mr. Thompson, but they were deliberate and calculated. You robbed Jennifer Collins of her future, her dreams, and her life. And in doing so, you devastated her family and this community. There is no place in our society for someone like you." The courtroom was silent as the judge pronounced his sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Mark showed little emotion when the sentence was read, but across the courtroom, Jennifer's family embraced one another as the weight of their loss finally gave way to a small, bittersweet sense of closure. The aftermath. Outside the courthouse, Diane Mercer addressed the press, standing beside Jennifer's family. "Today's verdict is a victory not just for the Collins family, but for every victim of intimate partner violence and obsession. Jennifer Collins's light was taken too soon, but her story will serve as a reminder that justice can and will prevail." Detectives Cooper and Lopez quietly left the courthouse, avoiding the cameras. As they walked down the steps, Lopez sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's over," she said. "Finally." Cooper lit a cigarette, exhaling slowly as he stared into the fading afternoon. "Yeah, but it'll never really be over for her family." "Still," Lopez said, glancing back at the courthouse, "we gave them something, a piece of justice. That's something." Cooper nodded, flicking his cigarette into the gutter. "Justice isn't perfect, but it's all we've got." The murder of Jennifer Collins wasn't just a crime. It wasn't even just a headline or a court case. It was a brutal reminder, a shot across humanity's bow, that monsters don't always wear masks. They exist among us, in plain sight, tucked into the quietest corners of society. They are neighbors, co-workers, and sometimes even friends. Mark Thompson was not the faceless boogeyman of urban legends. He was the man who held the door open in a shared hallway, a face forgotten in an instant. But behind that carefully constructed normalcy lay darkness, a river of suppressed rage, control, and obsession that silently swelled until it exploded in violence. His grotesque actions proved that obsession, unchecked, could be as deadly as any weapon, maybe even more so. Detectives Alan Cooper and Maria Lopez would carry the weight of the Jennifer Collins case with them long after it was closed. The case wasn't just one more folder on their desks. It was a living, breathing entity, a lesson in human fragility and the devastating effects of ignored warning signs. Reflections from the detectives. It had been weeks since the court delivered its verdict. The cold New York winter showed no signs of letting up as Cooper and Lopez found themselves sharing coffee at a diner just a few blocks from the precinct. A thick layer of snow coated the sidewalks, muffling the usual urban buzz. Inside the diner, though, the atmosphere was warm. Steam from freshly brewed coffee fogged the windows, and the distant hum of a jukebox filled the air. Lopez sipped her coffee, staring out the window at the blanketed streets. You ever notice how quiet it gets after a big storm, like the city itself is holding its breath? Rare moment of peace, Cooper replied, lighting a cigarette even though the staff had already motioned toward a no-smoking sign. He puffed once, ignoring the grimace from a nearby server. You take it when you can get it. Lopez set her mug down, her fingertips tracing the rim. Do you think he even realized what he'd become, Mark? I mean, do you think there was a moment where he looked in the mirror and saw it? Saw the monster? Cooper exhaled a cloud of smoke, leaning back in the booth. Maybe, but if he did, he convinced himself he was the victim. Guys like Mark, they create their own storylines, rewrite the world so they're always the one who's been wronged. If Jennifer didn't return his feelings, that wasn't her right. It was an insult to his delusion, and God forbid anyone gets in the way of delusion. Lopez nodded slowly, her expression darkened by the memory. All the signs were there. His co-workers knew how obsessive he was. The notebooks, the stalking, the little comments Jennifer told her friends about how he made her uncomfortable, but it's like no one thought it would ever go this far. Cooper leaned forward, his elbows on the table. People never think that guy will do it. It's always easier to dismiss the warning signs until the worst happens. Because once you admit there's a problem, then you're on the hook to do something about it. And most people don't want to get involved. Lopez let out a quiet scoff. Jennifer's death started long before he laid a hand on her. It started in his mind, Alan, back when he let jealousy fester there. Obsession is like a virus. It starts small but spreads. It eats away at reasoning, at empathy, and no one did anything about it. A society unprepared. The world around them wasn't short of cautionary tales like Jennifer Collins, but as Lopez pointed out, nobody wanted to believe the dark whispers at the edges of their community could ever grow teeth. It was easier to write Mark off as just another odd guy, an eccentric loner, easier to laugh him off than confront the storm brewing behind his quiet demeanor. But Jennifer's tragic death shattered that illusion. It forced the city to reckon with uncomfortable truths, that warning signs demand attention, that harmless obsessiveness isn't harmless, and that beneath the surface, even the meekest-seeming individuals can hide terrifying depths. Jennifer's co-workers later admitted to the small things they'd ignored. Mark staying late to clean up when Jennifer worked late, his constant hovering near her desk, how he lingered at the coffee machine when she was in the break room. One co-worker, teary-eyed during her testimony, confessed to hearing Mark mutter, "She'll regret it," under his breath when Jennifer once declined to join the team for drinks. But nobody acted, not until it was too late. A universal warning. "It's not just about Mark," Lopez said, turning her attention back to Cooper as they sat in their diner booth. "There are other Marks out there, probably walking past us right now." Cooper stubbed his cigarette into the coffee saucer beside his empty mug. "Damn right there are, and what we learned from this case better stick. Because if it doesn't, if people keep ignoring their gut, keep pushing these red flags under the rug, then we're in for another one of these sooner or later." Lopez stared at him, her brow furrowed. "What do you think we missed? What could we have done differently?" Her question hung in the air for a moment, heavy between them. Cooper sighed, rubbing his temples. "Probably nothing. By the time Mark crossed our radar he'd already snapped, but before us, before this whole thing turned into a case, someone could have stepped in, a co-worker, a friend, hell, family. He didn't come out of nowhere, he slowly built up to this. And society let him, Lopez said, her voice dripping with frustration. We turn a blind eye to the quiet rage of men like Mark because it's easier not to deal with it. Easier to hope someone else will notice, someone else will say something. Well, Cooper said after a long pause, we notice, that's why we're here. Justice and responsibility. The Collins family might never truly find peace, but they fought to make Jennifer's death a warning no one could ignore. Her mother, in particular, became an active voice in local campaigns, promoting awareness about the dangers of obsessive behavior and the red flags often overlooked in potential abusers. A memorial fund was established in Jennifer's name, supporting initiatives to combat stalking and intimate partner violence. The slogan, printed on banners and pamphlets, read, "Notice the signs, save a life." Cooper and Lopez couldn't shake the burdens of the case. They knew their work wasn't over just because Mark was behind bars. They knew Jennifer's story wouldn't be the last, but it was a reminder. Evil didn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it smiled as it held the elevator door open. A final reflection. Later that night, Cooper drove through the quiet streets of Brooklyn, his car's heater humming against the chill of December air. The windshield wipers lazily cleared the occasional flurry of snow that danced across the glass. His usual late-hour cigarettes lay untouched on the dashboard. As he parked outside his apartment, he lingered behind the wheel, staring into the mixture of yellow streetlights and snowflakes. In his mind, he saw Jennifer, her bright smile in the photos, her shattered family holding on to one another in the courtroom. He saw faces he knew would haunt him long after his badge no longer hung on his belt. People never want to believe the darkness is right across the hall, he muttered to himself, staring out at the city that never sleeps. But monsters don't hide in shadows anymore, they're right in front of us. And with that he grabbed his coat and stepped into the night, the crunch of his boots on snow the only sound in the otherwise silent street.